On August 2nd, 1939, a man who had not driven a car in years climbed into an automobile on Long Island, New York, and got hopelessly, hilariously lost. The man was Albert Einstein, the most famous scientist in the world, a refugee from Nazi Germany, a man who had calculated the relationship between energy and matter with a three-letter equation that would eventually reshape all of human civilization. He could explain the bending of light around massive objects, the photoelectric effect, the special and general theories of relativity. He could not, apparently, find his way from Princeton, New Jersey, to the summer home of a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard on Peconic Bay, Long Island, New York, without taking a wrong turn. He drove past his destination. He drove past it again. He stopped to ask a child on the side of the road, a child who had never heard of Dr. Albert Einstein and did not particularly care for directions. After considerable wandering, he found his way. Szilard was waiting. What Szilard told Einstein that afternoon in a modest Long Island living room with the windows open to the summer air was the most dangerous piece of scientific information in human history. Nuclear fission was real. Less than 8 months earlier, on December 17, 1938, in a chemistry laboratory in Berlin, Germany, two scientists named Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had bombarded uranium atoms with neutrons, tiny neutral particles, and had discovered something that defied everything people thought they knew about matter. The uranium atoms had split. They had broken apart into lighter atoms, releasing enormous amounts of energy in the process. The physics world was electrified. When the news reached Copenhagen, Denmark, where the great Danish physicist Niels Bohr was working with colleagues, he had literally grabbed the arm of the man next to him and exclaimed, "Oh, what idiots we have been! We ought to have seen that before." The thing that should have been seen was this. Splitting a uranium atom doesn't just release energy, it releases neutrons, the same neutrons that caused it to split in the first place. If those released neutrons hit other uranium atoms, and those atoms split and released more neutrons, and those neutrons hit more atoms, you would have what physicists call a chain reaction. Each splitting atom triggering 2 more, those 2 triggering 4, those 4 triggering 8, 16, 32, 64. In a fraction of a second, trillions upon trillions of atoms splitting simultaneously, releasing unimaginable energy. An uncontrolled chain reaction in a large enough mass of uranium would be, Leo Szilard explained to Albert Einstein that August afternoon in 1939, an atomic explosion of almost incomprehensible power. A single bomb, a single city, gone. And the Nazis knew about it. This was what frightened Szilard to the depths of his soul. He was a Hungarian Jew who had fled Germany in 1933, the year Hitler came to power. He had watched from a safe distance as the Nazi regime dismantled German democracy, stripped Jews of citizenship, burned books, opened concentration camps. He knew what the Nazi regime was. He had nightmares, vivid, specific nightmares about what would happen if Adolf Hitler had an atomic bomb before anyone else did. Not metaphorical nightmares, real ones, waking him at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat, his mind racing through scenarios of destruction that no one else around him seemed to take seriously enough to do so. Einstein listened carefully. He had not followed the developments in nuclear physics particularly closely. This was not his primary field in those years, but he understood the physics instantly, with the clarity that characterized everything he did, and he understood the political situation perfectly, having lived through the early years of Nazism himself. Das ist zum ersten Mal, dass ich davon höre. This is the first time I have heard about this. Then, after a pause, you have to do something. What Szilard wanted Einstein to do was to write a letter, not just any letter, a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, a letter from the most famous scientist in the world to the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere, warning that the most destructive weapon in the history of warfare might be possible and that Germany might be building it. Einstein agreed. The drafting of the letter took several weeks and several complete rewrites. Szilard wanted it to be clear and alarming without being alarmist. He wanted it to convey the physics in terms that a politician could understand. He wanted it to be short enough to be read and serious enough to be acted upon. He recruited several other Hungarian physicists who had also fled Europe to help, men who would later be called the Martians by their American colleagues, because their extraordinary intelligence, their relentless intensity, and their thick Hungarian accents made them seem like visitors from another world entirely. In the end, the letter that Einstein signed was 2 pages long, written in clear and non-technical language, and it contained the following remarkable paragraph. It appears almost certain that this could be achieved in the near future. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by a boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. The letter was dated August 2nd, 1939. It sat in a drawer for more than 2 months because no one knew how to get it to Roosevelt. The men who drafted it were émigré physicists, not Washington insiders. They did not have the connections to walk into the Oval Office and hand the president a letter warning him that the world was about to change. Eventually, through the intervention of a Wall Street economist named Alexander Sachs, who had the president's ear, the letter was hand-delivered to Roosevelt on October 11, 1939, by which point Germany had already invaded Poland on September 1st, and France and Britain had already declared war on Germany on September 3rd, and the Second World War had already begun and already claiming lives. Roosevelt read the letter slowly. He turned to his aide, Major General Edwin Parr Watson, and said 4 words that would set in motion the greatest scientific project in human history. Parr, this requires action. He was, in ways he could not yet imagine, not wrong.
To understand the Manhattan Project, you have to first understand the extraordinary human beings who made it possible. And to understand those human beings, you have to understand the catastrophe that produced them. Because the scientists who built the atomic bomb were, many of them, the products of one of history's greatest forced exoduses of intellectual talent. The 1930s were a catastrophe for Jewish intellectuals in Europe. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, and within months the Nazi government had passed a cascade of laws: the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, the laws defining who was and was not a German citizen, the laws restricting Jews from attending universities, that methodically dismantled the lives and careers of thousands of Germany's most talented people. German science, which had been the finest in the world for a generation, which had produced Albert Einstein, Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, James Franck, and a dozen other giants of modern physics, began hemorrhaging its best minds at a rate that would have seemed impossible to anyone predicting it 5 years earlier. They fled, not all at once and not always immediately, but steadily and in increasing numbers as it became clear that what was happening in Germany was not a temporary aberration, but a permanent transformation. They fled to Switzerland, to Denmark, to France, to England, and above all, eventually, to the United States, where universities in Cambridge and New York and Chicago and Berkeley were suddenly populated by brilliant, intense, accented men who had been the stars of European science 2 years before, and who were now, officially, stateless. They arrived with their knowledge and their terror and their European mathematical training, and they transformed American science in a way that is still felt today. Columbia University, where Enrico Fermi would work, Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, where Einstein settled, the University of Chicago, the University of California at Berkeley, these institutions, already good, became extraordinary almost overnight, simply because the best minds of Germany and Hungary and Italy and Austria had been expelled from their homelands and had landed on American shores. The Hungarians were perhaps the most remarkable group. Hungary, in the first decades of the 20th century, had produced per capita more world-class scientists and mathematicians than virtually any other country on Earth. This remains one of the genuine mysteries of intellectual history. Budapest's secondary school system, particularly the Fasori Gymnasium and the Minta Gymnasium, had somehow, in the space of a few decades, produced a collection of graduates who would reshape physics, mathematics, computing, and military technology for the rest of the century. Nobody has ever fully explained why. Some historians cite the education system. Some cite the intense, competitive Jewish intellectual culture of Budapest in those years. Some simply shrug and accept it as one of history's inexplicable gifts. Leo Szilard was one of them. He was born in Budapest in 1998, educated in Berlin, and had been thinking about the possibility of nuclear chain reactions since 1933, 6 full years before anyone had actually demonstrated that fission was real. This was not luck. This was a particular quality of mind that Szilard possessed, the ability to follow a chain of scientific reasoning to its end, even when the beginning of the chain was still theoretical, and to see the practical implications of what he found there. He had even taken out a patent on the concept of a nuclear chain reaction, assigning it in 1934 to the British Admiralty in the hopes of keeping the idea secret from anyone who might misuse it. In 1934, when most physicists still considered nuclear energy a distant and possibly impossible dream, Szilard was already trying to contain its danger. He was brilliant, restless, contentious, and almost impossible to work with in the conventional sense. He operated on a different schedule from other people, sleeping late, working in bursts of intense creativity, conducting most of his best thinking in bathtubs, which he regarded as ideal intellectual environments. He had ideas constantly, many of them extraordinary, and he expected the world to reorganize itself around his ideas rather than the other way around. He argued about everything. He changed his mind without apology and then argued with the new position with equal vigor. He was, by nearly every account, the most stimulating and the most exhausting colleague imaginable. Edward Teller was another of the Hungarians. Born in Budapest in 1908, he had lost part of his right foot in a streetcar accident as a young man, and he walked with a slight but distinctive limp that his colleagues could recognize from 100 yards away. Teller was brilliant in a different way from Szilard, less interested in the practical implications of science, more captivated by the beauty and power of physical theory. He was a pianist of near-concert quality and an intellectual of enormous range, and he was also, as his colleagues at Los Alamos would discover, a man who found it almost impossible to work on problems he hadn't chosen himself. His mind was always somewhere else, on the next problem, the bigger problem, the problem that no one else had thought to ask yet. During the Manhattan Project, when everyone else was focused on building a fission bomb, Teller was already dreaming of something far more powerful. John von Neumann, also Hungarian, was, by almost any measure, the most purely formidable intellect among a group of people who were not short of formidable intellects. Born in Budapest in 1903, he had memorized phone books for entertainment as a child. Not a party trick, but a genuine exercise of a memory that operated by all accounts at a level that other people found difficult to categorize as human. He could simultaneously conduct a complex calculation in his head and carry on a conversation on an entirely unrelated topic. He earned 2 doctorates from 2 different universities simultaneously, because doing them sequentially seemed to him inefficient. He would go on to make foundational contributions to quantum mechanics, game theory, mathematical logic, economics, and the design of modern digital computers, not as the work of a career, but almost as side projects to his other work. At Los Alamos, he would solve the detonation mathematics of the implosion bomb in calculations that took other mathematicians days, doing them on the train between New Mexico and New York. Eugene Wigner, quieter and more measured than his countrymen, but no less formidable, accompanied Szilard to Long Island to meet Einstein. It was Wigner who helped draft the Einstein letter. It was Wigner who worried more consistently and more deeply than perhaps anyone else in the project about what the atomic bomb meant for the future of human civilization. He was the conscience of the group, in a sense, not because the others lacked conscience, but because Wigner made it his particular business to ask the questions that everyone else found it more comfortable not to ask. And then there were the non-Hungarians. Enrico Fermi was Italian, born in Rome in 1901, the son of a railroad official, a man who had taught himself physics from old textbooks found in a street market, and who had been by the age of 25 appointed to a professorship at the University of Rome. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1938 for his work on radioactive elements and nuclear reactions, and he had used the Nobel ceremony in Stockholm as a vehicle for the most consequential of his many courageous decisions. Rather than return to Mussolini's Italy, where his wife Laura was Jewish and increasingly in danger, and where the racial laws were tightening, Fermi boarded a ship in Stockholm and sailed directly to New York. He arrived at Columbia University in January 1939, spoke limited English, and within months became the most important experimental physicist on the North American continent. Fermi's genius was of a particular and unusual kind. He was equally gifted as a theoretical and an experimental physicist, which is extremely rare, and he had in addition an extraordinary practical intelligence, an ability to design experiments, build apparatus, and solve engineering problems that made him invaluable for a project that needed to translate theoretical physics into actual hardware. He also had a gift for estimation. He could calculate, quickly and in his head, approximate answers to questions that other physicists needed hours to work through.
The first step toward building an atomic bomb was not building a bomb, The first step was proving, in a controlled and observable way, that a nuclear chain reaction was real, that it could be sustained, that it could be controlled, that it would behave the way the theory predicted. This sounds like it ought to be a simple demonstration. It was not. It was an engineering and scientific challenge of the first order, requiring the construction of the most unusual machine that had ever been built, in one of the most unusual locations imaginable. Enrico Fermi and his team began construction in November 1942 in a squash court beneath the West Grandstand of Stagg Field, the athletic stadium of the University of Chicago. The football team had been disbanded. Nobody was using the building. There was a large, high-ceilinged space, the squash court, that was, by the calculations Fermi had been making all year, just barely large enough. What they built there was called a pile, Fermi's term, characteristically pragmatic and unpretentious. It was a roughly spherical lattice of graphite and uranium, 25 feet wide and 20 feet high, containing approximately 40,000 uranium oxide slugs, each one roughly the size and shape of a hockey puck, embedded in 385 tons of graphite in a carefully calculated three-dimensional pattern. The graphite served as a moderator, slowing down the neutrons produced by fission to the speeds at which they were most likely to cause additional fissions. The uranium slugs were arranged to optimize the conditions for a self-sustaining chain reaction. The construction was done entirely by hand. Graduate students and a handful of senior scientists cut graphite blocks to specification, loaded uranium slugs into pre-drilled holes in the graphite, and stacked layer upon layer of the structure with their own hands. The graphite dust was everywhere. It got into their hair, their skin, their lungs. They went home each evening looking like chimney sweeps. The women in the neighborhood where several of them lived noticed that whenever the physics building was working late, the young men who came out at night were uniformly and inexplicably black. Threaded through the pile were control rods made of cadmium, a metal that absorbs neutrons very efficiently, that could be inserted to absorb neutrons and slow the reaction, or withdrawn to allow neutrons to multiply. There was an automatic safety rod that would slam back into the pile if the neutron flux, the measure of how many neutrons were bouncing around inside the structure, exceeded a certain threshold. There was a zip rod attached to a rope that ran through a pulley and could be pulled quickly to initiate the reaction. And there was one more safety mechanism, noted in the official records with admirable scientific understatement. A man standing beside the pile with a bucket of cadmium nitrate solution, ready to pour it over the whole structure if everything else failed. His name was George Weil, and he was 28 years old, and he was, on the morning of December 2nd, 1942, the last line of defense against an uncontrolled nuclear reaction in the middle of one of the largest cities in America. The experiment began at 9:45 in the morning. The team of approximately 40 people, scientists, engineers, administrators, moved into their positions. Neutron counters were turned on and began their characteristic clicking, measuring the number of neutrons present inside the pile. Control rods were slowly, carefully withdrawn. With each withdrawal, the clicking of the counters accelerated slightly. Numbers were called out, recorded, analyzed against the predictions of Fermi's calculations. Fermi watched with a slide rule, a mechanical calculating device, a ruler marked with logarithmic scales that allowed multiplication and division to be performed by sliding one piece against another. It was the calculation instrument of its era, and Fermi used it with a speed and accuracy that astonished his colleagues. He watched his slide rule, he watched the counters, he compared the numbers to his predictions. At 11:35, Fermi called a lunch break. The reaction was behaving exactly as predicted, but Fermi did not rush. He was a careful man, a methodical man, and he wanted everyone at full alertness when the critical moment came. They ate lunch, they came back. At 2 in the afternoon, Fermi ordered the control rods adjusted to a new position. The clicking of the counters accelerated, the numbers climbed. At 3:25 in the afternoon, the counters clicking had accelerated into a near-continuous sound, fast, faster, faster, and Fermi looked at his slide rule for a long moment and then looked up and said very quietly in the silence of the squash court under the grandstand, "The reaction is self-sustaining." There was no explosion, there was no light, there was no dramatic change in what you could see or feel. There was just the sound of the counters, slightly faster than before, and the knowledge held by the 40 people in that room and a handful of officials in Washington that something had happened that had never happened before in the history of the universe on Earth, a sustained, controlled nuclear chain reaction. The pile ran for 28 minutes, then Fermi had the control rods reinserted and the reaction stopped, and the squash court returned to silence. Someone had brought a bottle of Chianti. Paper cups were distributed. The scientists drank Chianti in paper cups in a squash court that smelled of graphite and uranium, and they did not make speeches, and nobody cried or laughed or shouted, because the event seemed too large for any of those responses. The only celebration was a phone call to Washington, delivered in improvised code because the phone lines were not secure. The Italian navigator has just landed in the New World. The voice on the other end asked, were the natives friendly? Everyone landed safe and happy. Fermi's pile, Chicago Pile 1 as it was formally designated, demonstrated something that changed everything, that nuclear energy could be released and controlled by human beings. The same principle that made it controllable also made it potentially uncontrollable. A chain reaction run slowly, with neutron absorbers keeping it in check, was a reactor. A chain reaction run without restraint, in a precisely configured mass of fissile material, assembled faster than the reaction could blow itself apart, was a bomb. All that remained was to build it.
The man who was put in charge of actually building the atomic bomb, turning Fermi's pile into a weapon, scaling up from a squash court demonstration to the most complex engineering project in human history, was not a scientist. He was a soldier. Brigadier General Leslie Richard Groves was 46 years old in September 1942 when he was assigned to command the Manhattan Engineer District, the Army's name for the atomic bomb project. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and broad-waisted, with a round face, cold eyes, and a reputation for getting things done that was based on the most impressive recent evidence imaginable. He had just overseen the construction of the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world, completing it on time and under budget in 16 months. He was, by all accounts, one of the most able military engineers in the United States Army. He was also one of the most difficult people in the United States Army. Groves was arrogant, not the casual arrogance of a man who has been told he is talented and had not had cause to doubt it, but the active, aggressive arrogance of a man who has developed a low opinion of human intelligence in general based on his extensive experience of it. He collected information and hoarded it, sharing only what was absolutely necessary, because he believed, often correctly, that information shared was information that would eventually leak. He made decisions unilaterally, resisting oversight from above with the same energy he applied to overriding objections from below. He had opinions about everything: architecture, food, music, the intellectual capacity of theoretical physicists, and he expressed them without diplomatic softening. His relationships with the scientists he was supposed to manage were from the beginning complicated. Groves regarded most scientists with the same mixture of admiration and exasperation that a practical engineer might feel for brilliant but impractical inventors. They were useful, they were often brilliant, they were almost uniformly terrible at following orders, keeping secrets, arriving on time, staying on budget, and accepting that some questions didn't need to be answered right now. He needed them, and he found them maddening in approximately equal measure. They, for their part, found Groves difficult, but often effective. He cut through bureaucratic obstruction with an efficiency that impressed even people who disliked him personally. When Groves wanted something, he got it. A site, a material, a piece of equipment, a security clearance, usually faster than the people who had told him it was impossible to get. His first significant act after taking command was to purchase 52,000 tons of uranium ore. He did this 3 days into his new role, before he had any clear idea exactly how much uranium he would need or in what form, because the ore was sitting in a Staten Island warehouse and he didn't want anyone else to get it. This instinct, acquire first, plan second, might have been reckless in a different context. In the Manhattan Project, it was exactly right. His second significant act was to meet Robert Oppenheimer and to decide against the advice of nearly everyone in the Army's security apparatus that Oppenheimer was the man he needed to build the bomb's scientific program. This decision was the most consequential of Groves's career.
By any normal standard of military security, J. Robert Oppenheimer should never have been within 100 miles of the Manhattan Project. His associations with the Communist Party were extensive and well documented. His wife, Catherine Harrison, whom he had married in November 1940, was a former member of the Communist Party who had left it but retained many friendships and intellectual sympathies from her years of involvement. His former girlfriend, Jean Tatlock, a brilliant and troubled woman who suffered from severe depression and with whom Oppenheimer maintained a complicated and emotionally intense friendship, was an active Communist Party member. His younger brother Frank and Frank's wife Jackie were both Communist Party members. Oppenheimer himself had attended Communist Party meetings in the late 1930s, had contributed money to organizations affiliated with the party, and had been a member of several front organizations, groups that appeared to be progressive civic organizations, but were actually organized or influenced by the Communist Party. None of this, in 1942, necessarily indicated disloyalty. The Communist Party of the United States was legal. Many intelligent, idealistic Americans in the 1930s had been drawn to communist or socialist ideas, partly in response to the Great Depression, which seemed to many people to expose the fundamental failures of capitalism, and partly in response to the rise of fascism in Europe, which the Soviet Union was the most vocal and seemingly determined opponent of. The party's membership included artists, writers, academics, lawyers, teachers and scientists who considered themselves patriots and who would have been appalled by the suggestion that their political sympathies made them enemies of their country. The Army's security apparatus, however, took a different view, and in 1942, with the United States at war with Germany and Japan and in an anxious, watchful alliance with the Soviet Union, the Army's intelligence officers regarded anyone with communist connections as a potential security risk, regardless of their stated loyalties or their professional value. Groves reviewed Oppenheimer's file, talked to people who knew him, and then traveled to Berkeley to meet him personally. The meeting lasted several hours. Oppenheimer, with characteristic intensity, discussed the physics of the bomb program, the organizational problems it faced, and the kind of laboratory that would be needed to solve them. Groves listened, said relatively little, and formed his judgment. "He's a genius, a real genius.
Why Oppenheimer knows about everything. He paused. He can talk to you about anything you bring up. Well, not exactly. There are a few things he doesn't know about. He doesn't know anything about sports. Groves decided to give Oppenheimer the job. He went to the Army's security apparatus and argued against stiff resistance that the project's need for Oppenheimer's particular gifts outweighed the security risks that his communist associations represented. He won the argument, though not cleanly. Oppenheimer was given a security clearance, but he was also placed under continuous surveillance by Army Counterintelligence Corps agents. His telephone was tapped. His mail was opened and read before delivery. His meetings were monitored. People he met with were noted and investigated. Oppenheimer knew about the surveillance. He operated under it without complaint for the duration of the war and beyond. He had, he said, nothing to hide, and the surveillance was a price he was willing to pay for the opportunity to do work that he believed, that everyone in the project believed, was absolutely essential to winning the war. The surveillance would become, in a different political climate, a weapon against him, but that was still a decade in the future. What mattered in October 1942 was that Groves and Oppenheimer had decided to build a laboratory, a secret laboratory, in the middle of nowhere, where the most brilliant physicists in the world could gather, share ideas freely, and build an atomic bomb before the Nazis built one first. They chose New Mexico.